The Beatles and the Dave Clark Five were both the best bands of their eras. Although the Beatles were the best of the best, they were shocked when their I Want to Hold Your Hand was knocked off the first position on the Billboard charts by the Dave Clark Five's Glad All Over. How did the Dave Clark Five become the rival of the Beatles? How were they able to surprise the best band of the century with their Glad All Over album? We are going to find out all about it today. But before we get started, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel below. Also, don't forget to press the bell icon so you can get the latest notifications on my videos. Thank you. Before we talk about the rivalry between the two bands, let me briefly introduce the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five. The Beatles. The Fab Four, also called the Beatles, were a British rock band that originated in the 1960s. The band's main members included John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. They were the core members, but there were some early members like Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best. Lennon and McCartney met each other when they developed a similar liking for American rock and roll music. The self-taught musicians surrounded them with other members, eventually leading to the formation of the band. Soon, the Beatles started touring different venues, and Beatlemania spread across the states. The band produced some of the best albums, including Revolver, Abbey Road, Please Please Me, and A Hard Day's Night. The band saw the extreme height of fame and limelight until its breakup in 1970. The Dave Clark Five. The Dave Clark Five, on the other hand, was one of the top British invasion bands of the 60s. The band was founded by Dave Clark, who was born in Tottenham, London. Dave played soccer for Tottenham Spurs team, which was in need of money. Dave formed a band so he could gather some. He bought a set of drums and learned how to play them. Dave started playing with Chris Wells and Mick Ryan, who left. Later on, Dave Clark, along with Mike Smith, Dennis Payton, Rick Huxley, and Lenny Davidson, formed the Dave Clark Five. The group had 22 hit records in Britain and 24 in America, along with 6 sellout US tours and 13 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show. Glad All Over, Bits and Pieces, Catch Us If You Can, and You Can't See She Is Mine are some of their famous hits. The Dave Clark Five disbanded in 1970. The Rivalry. The Dave Clark Five were one of the very few bands that were able to go against the selling power of the Beatles back in the day. In 1964, they released their first UK top 10 single, Glad All Over, which knocked the Beatles' I Want to Hold Your Hand off the top of the UK singles chart. The Beatles were quite surprised by someone crossing them on the billboards. Paul McCartney and John Lennon labeled the song of the DC5 as wonderful. They also said that competition's good for everybody and it is exciting. Glad All Over was also adopted by Crystal Palace Football Club as their anthem in the 1960s. It is played at the start of all home games and after full time when Palace wins. It is also sung by fans as a chant. During the 60s, every media outlet talked about the Dave Clark Five versus the Beatles rivalry, but actually, they weren't much comparable. The DC5 did lead the hearts and minds of the youth, but it was for a very brief period. They were not like the Beatles, who were the king of the era. After getting the first ranking from the Beatles, DC5 thought they could strongly compete with the Beatles, but they were labeled as the poor man's Beatles. Beatlemania was all over the states, and the band wanted to surpass the Beatles' success. But they were able to chase it for some time, because later, the band split. Apart from the rivalry, it would be interesting to know how the Dave Clark Five came up with the idea of Glad All Over and how they executed it, because it ultimately became the song that was able to surpass the song of the Beatles. Glad All Over. Glad All Over was composed by Dave Clark and Mike Smith. According to Dave, all the things that led to the song started when he used to go to clubs and ended up at the American military bases around England, which ultimately got him into American music. Glad All Over was something that the members learned on the clubs, especially at the Royal in Tottenham, through audience participation. It became like a football type of chant, which people could enjoy. That's how the DC5 got their audience. Dave Clark says, "I used to do a thing, I think it was by the Routers, a song called Halftime. It was an instrumental, but in the middle, you just stop and play the drums with a stamping type thing and get the audience stamping, and we'd all get the lights going along. We didn't have any money in those days, but I'd pay the guys a week to switch all the lights on and off." That's how the song got that sort of sound. The band got a great response with it. This was everything that Dave remembers, and that's how Mike and Dave worked on Glad All Over, and that's how it started. In those days, the band was not so famous, and they didn't have enough money. They used a little old Tamberg tape recorder and made it work in the studio. All the band members were doing extra jobs in offices and factories. But at the same time, they were working on some gigs and focusing on music. Mike and Dave worked with each other, making it sound great. Dave came up with a hook of the song, and he worked on the rest of it, keeping in mind that their music was supposed to be fun, to make people enjoy, not contain any message. They wanted their music to make people feel good. After going through 4-track machinery, mixing down the song on the stereo, and recording it at the studio in Lansdowne, the band perfected the imperfect song. The Dave Clark 5 were selling 130,000 records a day, but they aimed to sell over 1 million to knock off the Beatles. They were very excited because at that time, everything was about football. Paul McCartney declared the Beatles as the Liverpool sound, and the DC-5 were becoming the Tottenham sound. So it was all to do with football in those days. The DC-5 describes Glad All Over as a song inspired by football. It was something you could use on the terraces and made you feel good. In fact, the group had many problems when it first came out because people stamped on the bomb bomb and it cracked ballroom floors, and it got banned by Mecca and all those places. But that was what it was all about. I Want to Hold Your Hand. I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles was knocked off by the Dave Clark 5 Glad All Over. John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote the Beatles song, and it was the first Beatles record to be made using 4-track equipment. The youth discovered the Beatles, and this song left quite an impression on young girls of that generation. It became a special sound for the youth. It was recorded in 17 takes at Abbey Road Studios. It was released at the end of 1963, and by 1964, it had sales of more than 1.5 million copies. The song sold out like crazy, and at one point in New York, it was selling 10,000 copies an hour. I Want to Hold Your Hand gave rebirth to Beatlemania, and it is still remembered as one of the best tracks of the Beatles in history. But for the first time, the first ranking of the Beatles song was taken by someone else. It definitely came as a surprise, but it didn't affect the love of people for their music because they hailed to the top again with their new song. Some more facts. Although the Dave Clark 5 and the Beatles were rivals on the charts, Clark had an amicable relationship with the band. Lennon and McCartney often came to the parties Clark hosted, and it was considered a healthy thing back then. But we all know how the Beatles wanted to be on top, and they were very competitive with other artists. For a very brief moment, the Dave Clark 5 did compete with the Beatles, and at that time, it really wasn't immediately clear who would win the battle. The DC-5 fought. The Beatles fought back. But we cannot fight this, that the Beatles got their position back from the DC-5. Both bands produced some of the greatest hits in the world of music, but the bands ultimately scattered. This was all about the brief rivalry between the Beatles and the Dave Clark 5. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share your thoughts in the comment section below. I will see you guys with another video. Until then, keep watching my videos and keep supporting my channel.